My name is Hannah Lewis. I'm 34 years old. And the day that destroyed every assumption about me didn't happen when I was treating mass casualties in a Kandahar field hospital, or when I performed emergency thoracotomy with improvised instruments while under enemy fire. I was pumping gas at the Shell station when the explosion lit up the morning sky. My hands were reaching for the combat medic kit I still kept in my trunk 12 years of Army training, overriding 2 years of trying to forget before my conscious mind had processed that a commercial airliner had just fallen from the sky onto my adopted hometown. The local first responders were standing at the perimeter when I arrived, faces pale, radios crackling with dispatch asking for casualty counts they couldn't provide because the scope of injuries had paralyzed them. 73 people scattered across smoking wreckage, some walking dazed, some screaming, some making no sound at all because their airways were compromised. Chief Morrison, who'd once told the town council that hiring me for the clinic was settling because I was just a nurse, looked at me with the expression of someone drowning who'd just spotted a lifeline. "Lewis," his voice cracked, We don't have protocol for this. We need." But I was already moving, my body remembering what my resume couldn't say. That I'd been the senior trauma specialist for the 212th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, that I'd coordinated triage during the Kabul embassy bombing, that the nurse they'd dismissed had more mass casualty experience than every medical professional in 3 counties combined. That day, everything I'd buried to fit into small-town life came roaring back with the precision of 12 years, operating in war zones, where every second meant the difference between saving lives and counting bodies. Millbrook Community Hospital looked like every other small-town medical facility in rural Pennsylvania. Fluorescent lights that hummed with the frequency of low-grade headaches, beige walls chosen by someone who'd confused neutral with soul-crushing, and linoleum floors polished to the kind of shine that made 12-hour shifts feel like walking on ice while pretending you weren't exhausted. I'd been working there for 2 years, ever since I'd processed out of the Army and decided that Millbrook population 8,000, 2 hours from anywhere that mattered, was far enough from my previous life that I might be able to pretend it had never happened. The morning routine was predictable to the point of meditation. 6 a.m. arrival, change into scrubs that smelled like industrial detergent, check the assignment board to see which patients I'd be responsible for keeping alive, while the actual doctors got credit for their survival. Vitals, medications, wound care, the tasks that kept hospitals functioning but that nobody noticed unless they weren't done. "Morning, Hannah, doctor," Patterson said without looking up from his tablet as I passed the nurse's station. Not rude exactly, just the kind of casual dismissal that comes from years of medical hierarchy where nurses were support staff rather than medical professionals in their own right. I'd learned not to correct people when they called me just a nurse. Learned not to mention that I had more trauma experience than every physician in this hospital combined, that my hands had literally held hearts that were trying to stop beating, that I'd performed procedures these doctors had only read about in textbooks. Because explaining my background required discussing 12 years I was trying to forget, and forgetting was easier when you let people underestimate you. The coffee room was where the casual cruelty usually happened, not intentional malice, just the thoughtless way people talked about professions they didn't understand or value. "I could never be a nurse," Sarah from billing said, pouring her 3rd cup of the morning. "Just taking orders all day, cleaning up after people. Where's the satisfaction in that?" Jessica, one of the medical assistants, laughed in agreement. "Right? Like, nurses are important, obviously, but it's not exactly saving lives. That's what the real doctors do." They didn't notice me standing there, or maybe they did, and it didn't matter because I was part of the scenery, someone who existed to facilitate their workday but who didn't register as a person with feelings or achievements worth acknowledging. I poured my coffee in silence and left before they could invite me to agree with my own diminishment. The patients were often worse, though they didn't mean to be. They'd look past me while asking questions, their eyes scanning for the doctor who would give them real medical information. When I'd explain their medications or demonstrate wound care, they'd nod politely and then ask the same questions again when Dr. Patterson made rounds, as if information only became valid when delivered by someone with MD after their name. "Excuse me, Nurse Mrs." Henderson said that morning, her tone carrying the particular dismissiveness that came from a lifetime of treating service workers as interchangeable. Can you get the doctor? I have actual medical questions. I'd just spent 20 minutes explaining her post-surgical care in detail that would have impressed her if she'd been listening. But I smiled with the professional patience I'd perfected and went to find Dr. Patterson, who would repeat everything I'd said in slightly different words and receive gratitude I'd never get. This was my life now. Competent, invisible, underestimated. The woman who'd once coordinated mass casualty triage during the Kabul embassy bombing now fetched doctors for patients who thought medical expertise was determined by title rather than experience. My high school friends, the ones who'd stayed in Millbrook, married young, built lives around local businesses and community events, treated my career with the kind of gentle condescension usually reserved for discussing someone's harmless hobbies. Still nursing? Amanda asked at our monthly dinner, her tone suggesting she was asking about a phase I was going through rather than a profession I dedicated my adult life to. I thought you'd have gone back to school for something more. I don't know, impressive? You were always so smart. Still nursing. Like it was a consolation prize rather than a choice. Like I'd somehow failed to achieve something better and had settled for a career that didn't require the intelligence or dedication of real professions. I like what I do, I replied, the lie so practiced it almost felt true. That's so sweet, Jessica chimed in, her real estate success making her feel qualified to judge everyone else's career choices. Nurses are the backbone of healthcare. You guys don't get enough credit for all that support work you do. Support work. While they'd been building businesses in a town that had never seen combat or mass casualties or the kind of medical emergencies that required split-second decisions between life and death, I'd been learning to perform procedures that would make them vomit if I described them in detail. But explaining that required discussing things I'd come to Millbrook specifically to forget. Walking home after my shift, I passed the billboard that had been there since the hospital's last fundraising campaign, Heroes Work Here, in bold letters over a photo of smiling doctors in white coats. No nurses in the image, naturally. We were the backdrop to other people's heroism. I didn't look at it anymore. Looking at it meant remembering that I'd once been someone whose competence was recognized, whose decisions carried weight, whose experience made the difference between missions succeeding and soldiers dying. But that person lived in a past I was trying to leave behind, buried under 2 years of small-town routine and deliberate underestimation. The apartment I rented above Miller's Hardware was small enough that I could touch opposite walls if I stretched, furnished with Goodwill finds and the kind of sparse functionality that suggested temporary residence rather than permanent home. On the walls, nothing. No photos, no decorations, nothing that would remind me of who I'd been before I'd decided that being nobody was safer than being somebody. That night, I made dinner pasta from a box, sauce from a jar, and ate it while watching television shows I wouldn't remember by morning. The routine of deliberate forgetting practiced until it felt almost natural. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Still planning to visit for Thanksgiving? Your father wants to know if you're bringing anyone. Bringing anyone. Code for, are you still single and failing to meet our expectations for grandchildren? I typed back a non-committal response and returned to my forgettable television, my forgettable dinner, my forgettable life. This was what I'd chosen. Small-town anonymity, professional underestimation, the safety of being ordinary. It was easier than carrying the weight of 12 years that had left scars nobody could see but that made sleep feel like negotiating with nightmares. They thought I was just a nurse, background, support, forgettable. And I'd worked hard to make them think exactly that, because being underestimated was easier than explaining why I flinched at loud noises, why I kept a trauma kit in my car, why I couldn't watch war movies without my hands starting to shake. Tomorrow would be the same. Fluorescent lights, beige walls, patients who looked through me while asking for doctors, friends who wondered why I'd settled for a career that didn't require real intelligence. I'd survived 12 years of combat medicine by staying calm under pressure, by making decisions while mortars were landing, by holding soldiers together literally until medevac could reach them. But I couldn't survive small-town judgment, couldn't handle being seen for who I'd actually been, so I'd chosen invisibility instead. The irony was perfect. The woman they called just a nurse had more trauma experience than every medical professional in 3 counties combined. But that truth lived in a place I wasn't ready to access, buried under professional humility and deliberate forgetting. 24 hours later, when Flight 1847 fell from the sky, that truth would come roaring back, whether I was ready or not. The explosion hit the morning sky like God tearing a hole in the world. I was at the Shell station on Route 22, pump handle in my hand, when American Airlines Flight 1847 disintegrated 3 miles east, close enough that I felt the concussion in my chest, close enough that debris was still falling when I threw the pump aside and reached for the combat medic kit I'd sworn I'd never need again. My hands found it in my trunk automatically, 12 years of muscle memory overriding 2 years of trying to forget. The kit was military grade, vacuum sealed, containing equipment that had no civilian explanation. Combat tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, chest decompression needles, the tools you carried when golden hour trauma care happened in places where helicopters drew enemy fire. Miller's cornfield was burning when I arrived, black smoke rising in columns that looked exactly like Iraq, exactly like Afghanistan, exactly like every nightmare I'd been medicating with small-town routine and deliberate underestimation. The volunteer fire department was establishing a perimeter, their movements careful and slow because they'd trained for house fires and car accidents, not mass casualty events with 73 injured scattered across a quarter-mile debris field. Chief Morrison, who'd told the town council that hiring me was settling for just a nurse, stood at the field's edge with a radio in one shaking hand, his face the color of spoiled milk. Lewis, his voice cracked when he saw me, and I recognized the expression. A man drowning who'd just spotted a lifeline he wasn't sure he deserved. We've got people everywhere. We don't have protocol for this. But I was already moving, my body remembering what my resume couldn't say. The chaos resolved into patterns I'd learned in places where hesitation meant body counts. Walking wounded, moving away from the wreckage. Critical patients silent because their airways were compromised. The particular stillness that meant you were already too late. Start triage, I said, my voice cutting through chaos with authority I'd buried for 2 years. Red tags for immediate, yellow for delayed, green for walking wounded, black for expectant. You, I pointed at a paralyzed EMT. Your red tag. You're with me. You, another volunteer, yellow. You're doing secondary assessment. Move now. The muscle memory was perfect and terrifying. Hands assessing injuries faster than conscious thought, brain processing vital signs and mechanism of injury and resource allocation, like I was back in the 212th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital coordinating trauma response during the Kabul embassy bombing. Ma'am, the EMT started, but I was already moving to the first critical patient, a woman in her 40s with bilateral femur fractures and signs of internal bleeding that meant she had maybe 20 minutes before shock killed her. Combat tourniquet, high and tight, both legs, I said, demonstrating while my hands moved with precision that came from applying hundreds of these under fire. You're going to think it's too tight. It's not. Tighter means she lives. Behind me, I heard more sirens, Millbrook's entire emergency response arriving to face something they'd only seen in training videos. Doctor. Patterson emerged from an ambulance looking like he'd just realized his medical degree hadn't prepared him for this, his eyes finding me with an expression I'd never seen before. Recognition that hierarchy didn't matter when people were dying. Hannah, he said, and it was the first time he'd used my first name in 2 years. What do you need? What I needed was a field hospital, a surgical team, and medevac helicopters that could evacuate critical patients to level 1 trauma centers. What I had was a small-town ER, volunteer first responders, and maybe 30 minutes before the news helicopters arrived to broadcast this disaster to the nation. Set up triage at the hospital, I said, already moving to the next critical patient, a teenager with sucking chest wound that meant his lung was collapsing. Red tags come first. We're going to lose people, so we prioritize who we can save. You understand me? He nodded, pale but focused. And I saw him processing the reality that the nurse he'd been dismissing for 2 years was suddenly the most qualified person in 3 counties to handle mass casualty trauma. The next 40 minutes collapsed into fragments. Chest decompression with a needle I'd carried since Kandahar, improvised cervical spine immobilization using backboards meant for recreational injuries, tourniquets applied high and tight on limbs that were hemorrhaging faster than hearts could compensate. A child, maybe 7, pinned under seat debris, screaming for her mother who was already black-tagged 50 yards away. I stabilized her spine, cleared her airway, marked her red, and moved to the next patient before my brain could process the horror, because processing meant freezing and freezing meant people died. "You, compress that wound," I snapped at a volunteer who was staring at exposed bone like he'd never seen an open fracture. "Direct pressure, now. You're not squeamish, you're saving a life." The memory hit me like friendly fire. Helmand Province, 2019, coordinating triage after a VBIED hit a convoy. 15 casualties, 3 surgeons, and me running triage because I'd done it enough times that my hands knew what my mind couldn't bear to fully remember. Dr. Patterson found me doing emergency cricothyrotomy on a patient whose airway was compromised beyond intubation procedure he'd read about, but never performed. Watching me create a surgical airway with equipment I shouldn't have had in my trunk but did because some training never deactivates. "Where did you?" he started, then stopped because the answer was obvious and horrifying. I'd learned emergency surgical airways in places where waiting for anesthesia meant patients died. The news helicopters arrived before medevac, their cameras capturing footage that would play on every network by evening. The small-town nurse in blood, soaked scrubs, commanding disaster response with authority that looked military because it was, coordinating care that was saving lives because I'd spent 12 years learning to save lives in conditions that made plane crashes look manageable. "Hannah," Chief Morrison approached while I was stabilizing a critical patient, his voice carrying something new, respect mixed with shame at every assumption he'd made. "The hospital's overwhelmed. They need someone to coordinate ER triage. Dr. Patterson says he says you've done this before. Like mass casualty response was a skill you picked up casually rather than something that required years of training in places where mistakes meant your friends came home in flag-draped coffins. "Tell them I'm coming," I said, finishing the last tourniquet and standing with movements that felt like rising from underwater. "Tell them to set up for damage control surgery because we're going to lose people if we try to fix everything." The camera caught at me covered in blood that wasn't mine, eyes carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from making life and death decisions for 40 minutes straight, voice steady despite hands that would shake later when adrenaline wore off. They thought I was just a nurse. Background, support, someone who took orders rather than gave them. But I'd been forged in places where fragility didn't survive, trained by necessity to perform under pressure that would break people who'd only seen trauma in textbooks. That morning, as Miller's cornfield burned and 73 people hung between life and death, the truth came roaring back with the force of 12 years I'd tried to bury. I wasn't just a nurse. I was a combat surgeon who'd operated in field hospitals while mortars landed, who'd coordinated mass casualty triage during terrorist attacks, who'd learned to save lives in conditions that would give Patterson nightmares. And every assumption they'd made about me shattered as completely as that plane. The Millbrook Community Hospital ER looked like a war zone by the time the last ambulance delivered its cargo, every bay occupied. Blood on floors that housekeeping couldn't clean fast enough, and the particular chaos that comes when a small-town facility faces trauma load it was never designed to handle. I'd been operating on autopilot for 3 hours, my hands moving through procedures with muscle memory that came from years of doing this under conditions far worse than fluorescent lights and adequate supplies. Tourniquets, chest tubes, emergency airways, the kind of interventions that kept people alive long enough to reach surgeons who could fix what I'd temporarily stabilized. By the time the last critical patient was transferred to Pittsburgh's Level 1 Trauma Center via medevac, I was standing in the staff bathroom washing blood from my hands, someone else's blood, always someone else's, and watching my reflection process what had just happened. The woman in the mirror looked like someone I'd buried 2 years ago, eyes carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from making life or death decisions for hours straight, posture that came from military bearing I'd tried to forget, and an expression that said she'd just remembered exactly who she was before she'd decided being nobody was safer. The knock came while I was still standing there. "Hannah?" Dr. Patterson's voice, tentative in a way I'd never heard before. There are people outside who want to talk to you. Families and reporters." Reporters. Of course there were reporters. A commercial airliner crashing in rural Pennsylvania was national news, And someone had captured footage of the small-town nurse coordinating disaster response like she'd done it before because I had. In places, these reporters had only covered from hotel rooms in Kabul. The families found me first, before I could process what facing them would mean. Mrs. Chen, whose daughter I'd stabilized with a chest tube performed in a cornfield because her lung was collapsing. Mr. Rodriguez, whose son I'd tourniqueted high enough that he'd keep the leg despite arterial bleeding that should have killed him. The Hendersons, whose 7-year-old I'd pulled from wreckage while making promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "You saved my baby," Mrs. Henderson sobbed, her hands gripping mine with strength that came from relief so profound it was almost violence. The other responders were frozen, but you knew exactly what to do. I knew exactly what to do because I'd done it hundreds of times in places where freezing meant your friends died. But explaining that required discussing 12 years I'd come to Millbrook specifically to escape. The reporters were less gentle, their questions designed to extract narrative rather than express gratitude. "Ma'am, how did a small-town nurse know how to coordinate mass casualty response?" The CNN correspondent's voice carried skepticism that would evaporate as soon as her producers ran my background check. "Training," I said simply, too exhausted for elaboration. "What kind of training?" she pressed, sensing story. That's when Chief Morrison intervened, the man who dismissed me as just a nurse now running interference like I was visiting dignitaries rather than his employee. "Miss Lewis served 12 years as a combat surgeon with the U.S. Army," he said, and I heard pride in his voice that felt complicated because it came too late to undo 2 years of casual dismissal. She coordinated trauma care in multiple war zones. Today, she saved lives because that's what she was trained to do. The reporter's expression shifted from skepticism to recognition. This was better than a plane crash story. This was a hero reveal, the kind of narrative that drove cable news cycles for weeks. By evening, my face was on every network. Local nurse revealed as decorated Army combat surgeon saves dozens in Pennsylvania plane crash. Footage of me in blood-soaked scrubs, coordinating triage with authority that looked military because it was. My hands performing procedures that most nurses had only read about because I wasn't most nurses and never had been. My phone exploded with calls I didn't answer and texts I couldn't read because processing them meant confronting everything I'd been avoiding for 2 years. Sarah from billing found me in the break room at 11 p.m. when the hospital had finally quieted to something approaching normal and I was drinking coffee that tasted like shame and vindication mixed in equal measure. "Hannah, she started, then stopped because there weren't words adequate for, "I'm sorry I spent 2 years dismissing your profession as glorified maid service while you were carrying experience that saved dozens of lives today." "It's fine," I said, meaning it and not meaning it simultaneously. "It's not fine," she insisted, her voice cracking. "We treated you like you were nobody. And today you were the only person who knew what to do. We could have lost so many more people if you hadn't been there. If I hadn't been there." The randomness of it felt cosmically appropriate that I'd moved to Millbrook specifically to escape combat medicine, only to have combat medicine find me at a gas station on a Tuesday morning. My high school friends Amanda and Jessica showed up at my apartment that night, probably having seen the news coverage that made their dinner conversation about my career choices look catastrophically wrong in retrospect. "We had no idea," Amanda whispered, shame etched across features that had been confident during our last dinner when she'd suggested I go back to school for something more impressive. "I know," I said, because they genuinely hadn't known and I'd worked hard to keep it that way. "Why didn't you tell us?" Jessica asked. And I heard hurt mixed with confusion, the realization that I'd let them underestimate me for 2 years rather than correct assumptions that had been painful but safer than explaining the truth. "Because," I said quietly, "it was easier to be nobody than to be someone who'd seen things that gave me nightmares. Easier to let you think I was just a nurse than to explain that I'd held soldiers while they died, that I'd performed surgery under fire, that I couldn't watch fireworks without my hands shaking." The truth hung between us like smoke, too heavy to dismiss but too late to undo 2 years of casual cruelty disguised as concern for my career choices. 3 weeks later, after the media attention had faded and Millbrook had returned to its regular rhythm, I was walking down the hospital corridor during my regular shift when I passed that "Heroes Work Here" billboard that had been there since I'd started. Someone had added a note in marker. They wear scrubs, too. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was acknowledgement that worth wasn't measured in titles or degrees, that heroism didn't always announce itself with medals and ceremonies, that the people you dismissed as just anything might be carrying capabilities you couldn't imagine until crisis forced revelation. I never told them about the 12 years I'd spent in combat zones. Never needed to. But truth has a way of surfacing when it matters most, when lives hang in balance and competence becomes the only currency that matters. They thought I was ordinary, someone who'd just been a military nurse, as if that was something small, rather than something that required surviving in places where ordinary didn't exist. That day, when 73 people fell from the sky onto my adopted hometown, I remembered who I was before I decided that being underestimated was safer than being seen. And I showed them, not through explanation or justification, but through action, the kind of competence that comes from years of training that never fully deactivates, that waits dormant until the moment when waiting ends and doing begins. Heroes don't announce themselves, they act. And sometimes they wear scrubs instead of uniforms, carry trauma kits instead of weapons, and save lives in cornfields instead of battlefields. But the training remains the same. The mission never changes. And on that Tuesday morning, the woman they'd called just a nurse became the only thing standing between disaster and mass tragedy, not because she wanted recognition, but because that's what she'd spent 12 years learning to do. Strength doesn't always wear medals. Sometimes it wears scrubs, works quietly, and waits for the moment when being underestimated transforms into being exactly who people need to survive. Hannah's story reminds us that competence doesn't require announcement, that the people we dismiss based on job titles might be carrying expertise we can't imagine, and that nursing, especially combat nursing, represents some of the most demanding medical training in existence. Her story isn't about proving doubters wrong. It's about the quiet strength of people who do essential work without needing recognition until the moment that work becomes the difference between life and death. Subscribe for more stories of unrecognized expertise, the medical professionals whose competence gets dismissed, the veterans whose civilian jobs don't reflect their capabilities, the people whose quiet excellence protects us until the moment when excellent becomes essential. Strength doesn't always wear medals. Sometimes it wears scrubs and saves lives while being called just a nurse.